So
What is nice? You look good. Nice tie. You're all knotted up. I like that.
it's, you know, it's a Friday. I don't know why, but so never play with fire. This backfired on me like earlier in the day. I Cetera bombed my wife with a little bit of "Let's Time I Fall in Love."
So it's Peter Cetera. You Cetera bombed her.
I Cetera bombed her. Of course, now I'm stuck with that cancer. It's kind of like, you know, what I've done to you a couple times too when I've Rick rolled you,
Right.
which is when I send you some clickbait, excuse me, of anything, and that when you click on it, it's Rick Astley singing "Never Gonna Give You Up," which became a thing. I don't really know where getting Rick rolled became a thing,
tremendous.
and so I've Cetera bombed my wife. Of course, it's now haunting me.
Peter Cetera. I hear that name, and it first of all, it makes me break out into sweat. But it's like very 1986. So it gets me. It's 1986. I was a senior and graduated college. Started working in mid-May of '86. So there was a lot of changes going on in 1986.
What were you wearing day one of Goldman Sachs? 86.
So it's Drexel Burnham,
Drexel,
1986. Sorry. Definitely had a suit. I had my father's wingtips, his shoes.
Nice.
Definitely knee-high socks. I wasn't wearing anything ostentatious in terms of suspenders or braces.
No braces, right?
But I was trying to sort of look the part. Actually, and it pains me to say this, but I had a briefcase and I had nothing in it, and that that got old very quickly. But yeah. I mean, I figured that's what people did. What the hell do I know?
You know, the irony of your briefcase is I was cutting grass in Southampton for the summer. I was done with my sophomore year at G-Town. I was also tending bar Friday and Saturday nights in Southampton. And I was living a very different existence. But I will say it was, you know, I like to think of the 80s as high school, college, and my first 2 years as a pro. So, I mean, they were momentous.
Fall of 1986, I'm sure you remember, because it's really the only thing you have to fall back on at this point. The New York Mets defeated the Boston Red Sox in the World Series. I was rooting for the Red Sox, number one.
Of course.
But what I was really rooting for was like 4 straight weeks of rain so they couldn't play it, because there are no two franchises I dislike more. But was it who threw his mitt up in the air?
It was Jesse Orosco, dude.
Jesse
It was Orosco. Come on. Everybody knows. And the bad guys won, as that great Jeff Pearlman book. So look, maybe the greatest baseball summer in New York, as people know. It was actually a decent time for New York sports. It was one of the better highs of the cycle. It's obviously we're very much at a low here. But thinking of movies, you had Top Gun, which, you know, say no more. As I've told you many times on Fast Money, your ego's writing checks your body can't cash. You had Bueller. You had some major stuff. And you know, again, music was great, but it was also, you know, arguably bands like Chicago, and we've had this chat too, were delivering some of their worst possible material relative to, I know you didn't even like Chicago in the 70s, but how about what Genesis was doing to us in 1986, right? So you've got Phil Collins, who's basically every other song on the radio, including like Against All Odds and other garbage like that. But then you've got Mike and the Mechanics, and even, you know, I'm gonna rain down on Peter Gabriel, who became unlistenable as well. He was pretty cool in the 70s. So Genesis or derivative Genesis absolutely haunted us in '86, and yes, I'm still pissed about that.
Then you had those horrible, you know, those Australian bands that somehow made it here, like Men at Work.
Men at Work.
You know, think about it. Zeppelin is now 6 years or 7 years from release. You know, their last album was 6 or 7 years ago. I mean, they were in the rearview mirror. Chicago, who is just, it's not a band, it's just an amalgamation of people playing instruments. Yet, you know, people will list them in their top 10. Well, they are in my top 10, but I won't tell you the category.
You know, Hall & Oates, Chicago, Genesis, you know, these bands, the Doobie Brothers. Michael McDonald.
Just stop. I just have to stop you. 2 things, and then you can finish up. You made a comment, and I let it pass, but in thinking about it, I can't just let this go without some sort of report.
Bring it.
86 was the best summer ever in New York. What are you, nuts? But I mean, if you want to believe that, that's fine.
That team had a lot of character. It had youth. It had grizzled veterans. It had a little bit of controversy.
Had a major drug problem. Had a lot of things. And
my
the
guess
other
is
thing you said, you
big
can't
80s.
you can't put Hall and Oates in with those. Hall and Oates is a fantastic group.
One word: man-eater.
I love Bruce Springsteen, but Dancing in the Dark is unlistenable. I mean, every once in a while, people get.
And you're gonna think you're gonna make fun of me for this, but you say Bruce, and actually, I think of Bruce Hornsby actually popped up in '86, and you know, take him or leave him. But I think Bruce has contributed positively. But I don't want to open up that can of worms. What was going on in the market in '86? We have the crash of '87.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the composition of the Dow Jones. If you think about it, was totally different. Companies that we knew as iconic today, my kids certainly have never heard of and would have no idea what those companies did. And I'm talking about, obviously, Kodak and Xerox, Union Carbide, which reminds me of Boiler Room. That's another show. Crazy times to think of the metamorphosis of the market. Certainly no dot-com stocks, but an interesting time for early technology companies.
Yeah, but I really think those early to mid 80s was when Wall Street really started to become a thing. That, granted, it was obviously a thing long before that, but it really became part of the vernacular in terms of what was going on in the United States. I think people really learned what Wall Street and stocks and markets were all about in the mid 80s, and specifically 86 on the eve of what was obviously the October 87 crash. But I think those years are when people started to really understand this thing that used to just be Wall Street in quotes. I think people sort of figured it out.
It's extraordinary to think about the lack of price discovery and transparency and market information that there was for investors out there. And frankly, I'm not going to say this was you and your boys at Drexel, but the ability for market makers and price givers to effectively dictate the terms on which any transaction got done. Spreads in the market were at 1.25 points, not decimals, not 1/100%. The commissions were obviously very different, but even the most liquid market in the world, the U.S. Treasuries, were trading at 16ths and 30 seconds, which is crazy when you think guys were doing trades for $40-50 million on the wire at the time. So again, to be an investor today and have the amount of market tools and market information, I know it's hard for a lot of folks to believe, but you actually have as much market insight and as much market, at least, transparency in terms of pricing as guys that are sitting on desks at Goldman Sachs. I'm sorry. And so as much as there's a maligning or there is a malignant problem here in terms of algos and to the extent that some of the computers are pushing around the markets, I do think it's not a bad time to be an investor and not be part of the Wall Street community.
The playing field has clearly been leveled. The pushback on what you said, and it's all accurate, the only pushback is you think about the amount of volume and everything you just mentioned today. In '86 was probably 1/1000th of what we see today. So although they were fleecing on the one side, there was not nearly the commensurate volume to make these people as wealthy as they could have been, given the width of the spreads and the lack of price discovery. But that's for another day.
Before going out, I think people would love. I'd love to know what were you driving in '86?
In 1986, I think I was driving. My parents had a Cimarron. Do you recall the Cadillac Cimarron?
Dude, that was kind of like suburban mafia.
I had one of those that I would get myself to and from the train station. The first actual car that I purchased, and I say this as a bit of an asshole, but it was early 90s.
Okay.
I bought a 1989 Jaguar XJS, black two-door 12-cylinder.
I can only imagine, man. Black Jag XJS. I remember the car. I'm not in a position to talk because my first car, which was bought with paper route money, basically, and I throw the disclaimer out there because it was a Volkswagen engine, but it was a Porsche 914. And it was, it was the one with a little target top, and it looked cool as you know what, but it ultimately ran like a Volkswagen. And that was probably 83. But in 86, I was driving a 66 Mustang convertible that I bought down at Georgetown and kind of left it on the side of the road. And this defines irresponsibility of youth. And with that, I hope that's not my kids.
On behalf of Tim and everybody here at the Tim and Guy Show, happy Mother's
Happy Mother's Day.
Enjoy the weekend.